Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to have been invited here to Manchester to give these lectures. The lectures, as indicated for tomorrow night and Thursday night, are covering old ground. What I'm talking about tonight is a new project, so it is still in its formative stages. As Holocaust studies emerged as a legitimate field of academic study in the 1980s, Raoul Hilberg's three categories of perpetrator, victim, and bystander became a standard format for delineating basic subfields of specialization. The most heterogeneous and ill-defined of these categories was that of bystander, as it included a spectrum of historical actors that stretched from opportunistic profiteers, parasites, and beneficiaries of the suffering of others, through indifferent, frightened, and even silently sympathetic neighbors and spectators, to those rare individuals and groups who sought to help the afflicted, and those even rarer people who actually found practical and effective ways to successfully rescue endangered Jews from otherwise near certain death. The study of Holocaust rescue has thus by necessity become a subfield in its own right. And indeed we find that even that subfield encompasses quite diverse and variegated phenomena. I would hazard at least four distinct forms of possible rescue activity which historians have discussed. First, there is international rescue. What did other governments or international organizations do to rescue Europe's beleaguered Jews, or more often, not do? The most prolific manifestations of this approach are the studies of FDR, the United States, and the Holocaust on the one hand, or Pius XII and the Vatican on the other, which are histories of the lack of rescue, of willful blindness and callous indifference, of missed opportunities and inadequate prioritization, of political and moral failure. Here the historian's temptation is to write accusatory, judgmental accounts whose dominant tone is the smug assurance of hindsight that we surely would have behaved more nobly than those we weigh and find wanting. And this dominant approach, in turn, has called forth historical defense briefs of tarnished heroes. Thus, the historiographical wars over the respective roles of FDR and Pius XII in the Holocaust continue unabated. And it is the rare historian who has found the right balance of critical analysis and explanatory understanding. A second form of rescue is national. Here, of course, Denmark has been seen as the exemplary country that, acting with national consensus, but also with the undoubted advantages of relatively benign German occupation, the nearby neutral country of Sweden willing to take Jews in, and its small Jewish population of 7,500, saved virtually its entire Jewish population. More problematic are the states allied to Hitler that operated according to a double standard, trading the lives of despised alien or foreign Jews for territorial gain, but protecting their own Jews from deportation, though not from discrimination and exploitation. Bulgaria, Hungary, and even Romania all exhibited this deeply compromised pattern of behavior that resulted in the rescue of some Jews and egregious complicity in the death of others. Least well known are the actions of Hitler's major ally, Fascist Italy, where prior to the fall of Mussolini and the Nazi occupation of most of the country in the fall of 1943, military and government officials not only protected their own Italian Jews, but also non-Italian Jews in the Italian occupation zones of southern France, the coast of Yugoslavia, and southern Greece. That Mussolini's Italy was one of the sanctuaries to which threatened Jews fled the Nazis is surely one of the great ironies of World War II. Group rescue is a third form, carried out by organizations like Zagota in Poland, or Varian Fry's network, the Emergency Rescue Committee in southern France, which were explicitly created for or primarily dedicated to the purpose of helping Jews and other victims of Nazism. A related form of group rescue would be communal. Already existing communities where the pre-established subculture created an environment conducive to providing aid and hiding to Jews when their situation became dire. Here, of course, Le Chambon-Sauvignon in southern France is the best known example. And finally, there is solitary rescue. All over Europe, individuals, usually at great danger to themselves, hid desperate Jews or helped them in other important ways, not as part of an organized effort, but on their own. Perhaps nowhere were such solitary rescue efforts more dangerous than in Poland, where German punishments were especially draconic and the threat of denunciation, rather than a presumption of solidarity and conspiracy of silence against the foreign occupier on the part of one's neighbors, was pervasive. The presentation of such a typology requires two qualifications. First, if the historians of international rescue are often accusatory histories that focus on the omissions and failures of world leaders to have done what could and should have been done to save more Jews, the histories of group and individual rescue often succumb to the opposite temptation. They become celebratory, even hagiographical works seeking to find edifying and redemptive aspects to a story that is otherwise overwhelmed by far too many perpetrators and far too many victims. It is no accident that the permanent exhibit of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., after 3 floors of cumulatively depressing displays, ends with an uplifting section devoted to rescuers. Second, such a typology of Holocaust rescue actions is, of course, an historian's construct. I create it in order to give order and structure to my way of thinking about a vast number of diverse and unique events. In reality, many individuals involved in rescue operated both out of their own motives and with their own initiatives on the one hand, but also within the framework of various organizational and communal rescue activities on the other. Individually, they expanded and transcended the purposes of the organizations for which they worked, but in turn could not have succeeded without the resources and support of other rescue networks and communities. Such a man was Tracy Strong Jr., the subject of my current research project. The preliminary findings of that project, and indeed let me emphasize the word preliminary, are what I wish to share with you tonight. First, a word about how I came to the topic of Holocaust rescue in general, one about which I have never previously researched or published, and to Tracy Strong in particular. I spent most of my career researching the making of Nazi Jewish policy and Nazi perpetrators. Then in 2 of my most recent books, I shifted my focus to the prisoner community of the Nazi slave labor camps in Poland and the methodological challenges of using survivor testimony to write history of such a community. At that point in time, I had also helped a number of graduate students find suitable dissertation topics in Holocaust studies, and my own backlog of potential topics waiting to be done was exhausted. For the first time in my career, when people asked me what I was working on next, I had no answer. That is also when Pierre Sauvage, the founder and president of the Chambon Foundation and the director of the documentary film Weapons of the Spirit about the rescue activities in that village where he had been born to shelter Jewish refugee parents in 1944, informed me that he had the letters and journals of Tracy Strong Jr., who as a young American had worked in the Vichy internment camps in southern France and rescued Jews threatened with being turned over to the Germans for deportation to Auschwitz in 1942. Would I be interested, he asked. Offer the historian's windfall of rare and hitherto unexamined personal documents relating to a topic that was entirely new to me, I said yes. Who then was Tracy Strong, and how did he become a Holocaust rescuer? His grandfather, Sidney Dick Strong, was a minister of a congregational church in Seattle, Washington, noted for preaching the so-called social gospel, emphasizing the obligation of Christians to do good and serve others in this world over issues of doctrinal purity or gaining converts, until his congregation deserted him over his pacifist views in World War I. Tracy's father's sister, Anna Louise Strong, was Seattle's most noted feminist radical. Elected to the Seattle School Board in 1916, she advocated for greater child services for poor children. Her support of the so-called Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, in a 1918 conflict with mill owners in the nearby city of Everett, led to a recall election that removed her from the school board, and her involvement in the 1919 four-day general strike in Seattle completed her disillusionment with America. She spent most of the rest of her life first in the Soviet Union and then in China, where she died in 1970. In short, when Tracy Strong Jr. was born in Seattle in September 1915, it was not into a typical American family. His father took his own family away from Seattle in 1923, assuming a position as director of youth activities of the International YMCA in Geneva after an adventurous trip that took the family across the Pacific to Japan, Korea, Manchuria, China, Singapore, Burma, India, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestine Mandate before reaching Europe. With the exception of 2 separate years back in Seattle to attend an American school, Strong was educated in French language schools in Geneva. He was also sent by his parents for 1 year of school in Germany to learn that language as well. That was the year 1932 to 1933, where the 17-year-old American witnessed in person a Nazi rally and Hitler's speech in October 1932. He wrote to his parents that he was not impressed by Hitler, but he was impressed by the very noisy demonstration. Strong's grandparents, parents, and his aunt Louise Ann had all attended Oberlin College in Ohio, a college noted for its progressive record in being the first to educate both women and African Americans in the first half of the 19th century. Thus, the third generation, Tracy and his brother and sister, all dutifully attended Oberlin College as well. And here, for reasons of honesty, I should say I'm also an alumni of that same school. Strong entered Oberlin College as a freshman in the fall of 1933, and given the large number of students who came from abroad, both American and foreign, it was a quite suitable choice. He felt at home in the international atmosphere. Graduating in 1937, he then attended Yale Divinity School for the next 3 years, and remembered being particularly influenced by the theologian Richard Niebuhr, Reinhold's brother, and the Luther scholar Roland Bainton. Having no desire to take up the life of an ordained church pastor, Strong decided in effect to return home and join the family business. This meant taking a American ship across the Atlantic to Lisbon, and after some delay at the border, traveling by train across recently defeated France to reach Geneva in July 1940. Here, like his father, he went to work for an international organization, in this case the newly formed European Student Relief Fund, an ecumenical consortium formed by the Protestant World Student Christian Federation, the Catholic Pax Romana, and the secular left-leaning International Student Organization. Its goal was to provide humanitarian aid to European students victimized by the war. As an employee of the European Student Relief, but under the auspices of the International Red Cross, which by provisions of the Geneva Convention was permitted to visit POW camps of signatory countries, Tracy Strong went to Germany in September 1940, where he was assigned a number of camps holding French POWs near Kassel. His task was to talk to both German commandants and POWs in order to organize constructive activities for the prisoners. As enlisted men but not officers were sent to work all day, his job in effect was to rescue French officers from boredom by helping them to organize educational, athletic, and cultural events. He learned several important skills: how to negotiate with camp commandants and persuade them that he could make their jobs easier by keeping their prisoners in good spirit, how to work with prisoners to help them improve their own lives, and how to operate strictly within the rules while being carefully watched for the slightest infraction, such as accepting prisoner communications. Nonetheless, at the end of 1940, the Germans barred Strong from further camp visits and returned to Geneva in April 1941. At this point in time, Strong could have easily returned to the U.S. via Portugal and Spain, but Donald Lowry, the head of the YMCA in France, requested help from the European Student Relief for a volunteer to attend to the needs of students being held in civilian internment camps in Vichy, France, and Strong immediately volunteered. To understand the context within which Strong was going to work for the next 18 months, we need to know something about Vichy, France, and its internment camps. In the interwar period, France, relative to other countries, was a very generous recipient of refugees. But with the new flood generated by Hitler's occupation of Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia in 1938 to 39, the French increasingly perceived their country as saturated. Pre-war legislation allowed first for the assigned residence of illegal refugees, and then for the creation of so-called centers for undesirable foreigners. The first people to experience mass internment under these decrees were some 400,000 desperate Spaniards who fled over the French border as a consequence of Franco's victory in the Spanish Civil War in the spring of 1939. Thus, in origin, these camps, strung along the southern border of France, were more like the American civilian internment camps on the West Coast for Japanese and Americans of Japanese ancestry than Nazi concentration camps. And their original internees were overwhelmingly Spanish rather than Jewish. Unlike the American internment camps, however, the main criteria for being interned were lack of documents, employment, and residence, not racial origin. Homeless and unemployed refugees were at greatest risk. This situation was transformed in two ways in the summer of 1940. First, rapid German victory over France led to the division of that conquered country into occupied and unoccupied zones. And the new French government removed to the resort town of Vichy in unoccupied southern France. Second, yet another wave of refugees from the Low Countries and northern France, including many foreign Jews who were fleeing the Germans once again, deluged the unoccupied zone. The collaborationist Vichy regime was nationalist, traditionalist, xenophobic, and overtly Catholic, and it sought to carry out a conservative counter-revolution, erasing the legacies of the hated republics that had shaped a liberal political culture in the country since the French Revolution. Initial measures included both the passage of Vichy anti-Jewish legislation, negating equality before the law as a fundamental legacy of the French Revolution, and the use of the existing internment camps for those foreign refugees deemed most undesirable. Not surprisingly, among the array of anti-Nazi refugees from many nations, foreign Jews were interned disproportionately. Tracy Strong's primary task was to make periodic visits to these various camps in order to work with French local authorities, camp administrators, prisoners, and various French and international relief organizations to enhance the morale and quality of life of the prisoners, especially the young people whom the European Student Relief had been created to help. In short, he was continuing his previous work of bringing humanitarian relief to young internees, only now he was working in Vichy internment camps to help foreign refugees rather than in German POW camps to help captured French officers. It is here that I want to turn to Tracy Strong's letters and journals to examine in particular the human side of such work, his feelings and perceptions, his bouts of frustration, anguish, and near burnout, as well as his moments of triumph. Unlike some rescue studies, I will not concentrate on the issue of motivation. A third-generation member of a family devoted to living the social gospel and a third generation of Oberlin College graduates, for Tracy Strong, helping people in need was simply the self-evident purpose of life. More interesting to me was the path he followed, the manner in which he reacted, and the obstacles he overcame to become what we now call a Holocaust rescuer, though that was never his own self-understanding at the time. Here, in my opinion, the how is more interesting than the why. Though Tracy Strong tried to keep a journal and write to his parents on a fairly regular basis, nonetheless, the written record is somewhat uneven. After his initial trip to France in May 1941, he wrote little during the following summer. He kept a good record from the fall of 1941 through the winter and spring of 1942, but less again in the next summer. And then in what we shall see is the most crucial period, from August to November 1942, just when the historian would hope for the most complete documentation, in reality, Strong was so busy that the written record becomes even more fragmentary. Though keeping his departed family's apartment in Geneva, to which he periodically returned, Strong spent most of the 18 months between May 1941 and November 1942 traveling to the various camps in southern France or working at the YMCA headquarters in Marseille. In all, there were 47 internment camps and site-of-work companies in Vichy France that fell within Tracy Strong's jurisdiction, the most important and most frequently visited of which were Gors and Rivesaltes, with inmate populations varying between 5,000 and 8,000. There were many other camps, La Vernay, Noa, Recibedou, Limy, with populations of roughly 1,000 to 2,000. Strong also visited a POW camp for interned British military, mostly airmen who had escaped from occupied France. 2 women's camps for communists, prostitutes, spies, and thieves, as well as those he termed, quote, quite innocent, but, quote, arrested for their nationality, where to his relief, the internees were placed in separate barracks according to, quote, profession, and even a sanatorium for TB patients who had been removed from other camps. While various relief organizations, especially the Red Cross, had the task of trying to improve food supplies to the camps, Strong's initial assignment was to improve internee morale. First, he had to persuade camp directors to provide a common meeting room or foyer where internee activities could take place. One key contribution was to provide books for camp libraries. Another was sporting equipment. Culturally, he tried to find musical instruments so that internees could both keep up their own skills and provide entertainment for others. Following a piano concert of Schubert at Lemy, he wrote it, quote, "As long as men can play and enjoy listening to such music, I will not give up all hope." Many artists asked for oil paints, which were never available in sufficient quantities. Strong lamented that aside from a few poets, internees did not seem interested in writing, the materials for which would have been easier to procure. A gramophone with a dozen recordings of Bach and Beethoven was greatly appreciated in Recrow, where a considerable number of the internees were, quote, from a good cultural background. Perhaps the single biggest entertainment success came when the YMCA was able to purchase a movie projector whose operator toured the camps each month. For internees who had often not seen a movie in 3 years, this was a, quote, enormous success that made everyone very happy. Most challenging was the attempt to establish workshops where internees could produce various crafts, and again, tools and materials were very hard to come by. Between trips to the various internment camps, Strong worked out of the YMCA office in Marseille, where he tried, mostly in vain, to cope with the flood of non-interned refugees who turned to the YMCA for help. He was not able to provide that which was most frequently requested: lodging, financial support, and of course, most important of all, exit visas. Another task he performed was to serve as Lowry's secretary when Lowry presided over the monthly so-called Nimes Conference, a meeting that brought together representatives of approximately 25 humanitarian relief organizations working in Vichy France, including both Jewish and non-Jewish French organizations, as well as religious and secular international organizations. In addition to his attempts to improve camp morale in general, Strong was also concerned for the pastoral care of the small number of Protestant internees in the camps, where the vast majority of internees were Catholic or Jewish. Whenever he was in a camp on Sunday, he attended and sometimes helped conduct Protestant services. He noted that these services usually draw a mixed audience of 20 to 30 internees, whose one commonality was that they understood very little of the French language service. Working alongside the French Protestant student organization CIMAD in the camps, Strong felt both challenged and annoyed by their pietistic fervor and theological pretensions. Following an Alpine retreat with CIMAD volunteers, he vented, quote, "The whole emphasis upon converting and evangelizing people, not upon social work. I haven't dared to put in my own oar at all, or hardly yet, because I feel that I would be on completely different grounds. Either I don't have a good theological basis for my work, or else the French just love to talk in the air and not get down to concrete work. It is practically entirely being saved by faith. Works are entirely in the background." Despite such an occasional tension between the social gospel tradition of Strong's branch of American Protestantism and the fierce pietism of French Protestants, it was members of CIMAD with whom Strong worked and socialized most closely during his months in France. As a humanitarian relief worker traveling throughout unoccupied France, Strong faced 2 debilitating challenges that wore on him. The first was the sheer physical challenge of constant travel in a country where food was tightly rationed and passenger train travel was increasingly curtailed. Traveling constantly between camps on overcrowded trains night and day He often found himself simply struggling to get aboard and find a place in the corridor where he learned to sleep sitting on his suitcase. 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night became, quote, normal. A tall, slight man, he would regularly leave Geneva weighing 174 pounds and weeks later return weighing 160. His periodic visits to Geneva were necessary to, quote, get filled up and regain lost weight. More serious was the psychological strain of his Sisyphean situation, where the problems with which he and other relief workers struggled were so intractable and systemically overwhelming in comparison to the resources they could possibly bring to bear, that Strong periodically experienced burnout. After the initial summer, he concluded optimistically that, quote, these past 3 months have been very worthwhile and full ones. Encouraged by the musical and theatrical productions that had been organized in Gurs, he noted in November 1941, quote, Gurs always gives me the feeling that there are wonderful possibilities in people, but it is a shame to shut them up in camp in order to discover what a person can do. Amidst a muddy, dirty, cold hell, one sees bits of opening toward heaven. At the same time, he acknowledged the embittering impact of internment, which he feared would leave, quote, its mark on these young fellows so that they will never be quite the same again. Even what he concluded had been a good day in many ways, he complained bitterly, quote, even dogs and cats are allowed relative freedom of movement, which we deny to a person because of his race, color, or religion. By early December 1941, his frustration boiled over. Quote, I somehow feel that I am just not capable of getting something definite accomplished. I find recently that I want more and more to get away from this work. However, when American entry into the war just days later temporarily raised uncertainty about the possibility of Americans continuing to do relief work in the Vichy camps, Strong rallied, quote, for the present, I am going happily ahead with my work. As long as I can continue to work in France, I'll certainly do so. In fact, while the U.S. found itself at war with Germany as well as Japan, U.S.-Vichy relations remained unchanged, and Strong and other Americans could still travel in the unoccupied zone. However, the Vichy camps faced an intensifying crisis after the turn of the year in the form of drastic wintertime food shortages. For the first time, Strong encountered not just hunger, but outright starvation. With people, quote, dying right and left in the camps because of undernourishment, Strong felt, quote, discouraged and tired, but he also, quote, wanted to do what is possible to help. He felt that he, quote, would rather be in an organization that was feeding and clothing people rather than administering purely to their spiritual and intellectual wants. At Gurs, where he had previously taken solace from the camp's cultural achievements, he noted, quote, there are 3 or 4 barracks full of people who have swollen arms or legs because they have practically starved. And the most recent concert had been canceled because the violinist was sick and the pianist was, quote, looking worse and worse as he just. At Rivesaltes, he observed that, quote, conditions were worse than ever, people literally starving to death. People I sat around the discussion table with a month ago were unrecognizable for weeks. With frustration, he expressed the growing irrelevancy of his own work. Quote, when a person asks me for some milk or bread, it is very hard to tell him that he should join an English class and forget his stomach. To his parents, he confessed, quote, I don't know whether it's I who doesn't get things done or we are just up against forces that are greater than any of us. I find that I'm getting in a rut and need complete change. I don't seem to have any initiative or imagination left, especially when it comes to helping in the camps. It's hard to do something along the cultural line when people are hungry, when a person can't concentrate because all he has to eat is a bowl of soup every day. Strong's growing sense of futility over his inability to help internees within the camp system goes a long way in explaining his increasing involvement with a project to get students out of the camps and lodged instead in a European student relief-sponsored Hôtel de Roche in the mountain village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. This was a project that he was primarily responsible for launching, and that without any premonition or foresight on his part would eventually cast him in the role of what we now celebrate as a Holocaust rescuer. Strong himself was aware of his limited perspective over the historical events he was involved in. As he wrote his parents on May 9, 1942, quote, I find that one gets so tied up in immediate and individual problems that one doesn't take or get much time to think about the larger aspects of the struggle and conflict in which we are living. It is said to be interesting to live and make history, but one doesn't get a great deal of time to think about it while it is going on. Moreover, Strong, in his universalist commitment to help all people in need, regardless of religion or ethnic identity, was very reluctant to write specifically about the Jewish identity of most of those whom he was helping. For the most part, he identified internees by their nationality rather than race, as if in doing so he was refusing to recognize the legitimacy of Nazi racial categorization in principle. He was, of course, perfectly aware in reality that the bulk of the internees in these camps were in these camps precisely because they were Jewish refugees and expellees from Central Europe, and that they were different from the other major contingent in camps, the Spanish refugees. On his first visit to the camps in early June 1941, he wrote, quote, "What struck me the hardest was that these people are just ordinary good folk whom, if they had been left alone in Germany, would undoubtedly have been passive and gone about their daily work. Although quite a few looked definitely Jewish in features, most of them could have passed for good German peasant stock. It is really tragic to think that there is a little future for the majority of them." It was also clear to Strong that the Jewish internees were a distinct group in their camp behavior. On the positive side, he noted, either these German Jews are much more voluble about their troubles than the rest, or else they have not been in camps long enough to have their spirit broken. I noticed that the Spaniards, many having been in camps for 3 years, are just sort of submitting and passive. The initial idea of setting up a student hostel in Chambon was motivated by the desire to rescue students from demoralization and hunger in the camps, not Jews from the Holocaust. Like Japanese Americans who were released from the Western internment camps if they volunteered for military service on the European front, or worked in Eastern factories, or found sponsors, internees could be released from the Vichy internment camps for outside supervised work. It was the bright idea of Strong, adopting a model used with success by the Quaker Relief Organization, that students could also be, quote, liberated from the camps if, with support from the European Student Relief in Geneva, they could be registered and lodged at some educational establishment, and French prefects at each end would officially approve the transfer of residence. Having heard about the village of Le Chambon from a colleague in Geneva, Strong went to check out the possibility in early October 1941. The very first evening in Le Chambon was auspicious, as butter, a rare delicacy, was served with dinner. Quote, "The food situation here seems to be quite satisfactory," he concluded. The next day proved to be most satisfactory as well. There was butter once again with a breakfast of bread and coffee au lait, a sermon preached by Pastor Thies with Pastor André Trachma assisting in the Huguenot community of the village, and then, quote, "an excellent meal with the Trachma family." Strong concluded that Le Chambon was, quote, "an active town from the point of view of religious and cultural life. I have a feeling that the church here is the real center of community life." They were then taken to see several houses which, quote, "might serve this winter as a student home." Among them was the Hotel de Roche, which had been transformed from an old barn into a quite fair hotel and was completely furnished. Strong concluded that it was the most favorable site. Quote, "There is no doubt that the location is superb and that the students would be better off here than in the camps. One has to wait and see if we can push it through. This depends upon the prefecture and upon a director being found who will be able to take charge immediately." 2 weeks later, Strong was back in Le Chambon. He had not yet found a director, but he had met the local prefect to, quote, "explain our idea of establishing a house in Chambon." The prefect struck Strong as, quote, "amused and cordial, and en principe agreed to helping get students out of camps, but not to providing food or coal for them." In Le Chambon, he visited other similar projects the town had welcomed. Quote, "The more I see of the various projects, the more eager I am to see that we do something good here," he wrote. The more he explored the Hotel de Roche, the more attractive it becomes. The availability of food being absolutely crucial, Strong noted once again how well he ate. Quote, "If I could stay here for a week, I would be fattened back to normal." To his parents, he wrote, the European Student Relief Fund is still working on a plan to establish a home at Chambon for the students. It all depends upon the director now, as we have money for 6 months. If this goes through and works out quite well, it should be a great boon to the various students who are scattered around France in and out of the camps. The following month, during a visit to Gurs, Strong began interviewing prospective students. Quote, I talked with each one personally. They have all been through very much the same mill. Left Germany or Austria in 1933 or later, studying in Belgium for a while, arrested on May 10, 1940, and shipped off down to the southern part of France. What an amazing story these fellows will have to tell when the war is over, but one wonders if their odyssey will be finished then also. Just what does the world hold in store for them, regardless of how the war comes out? All are Jews, and I'm afraid they are so permanently uprooted in many cases that they will have difficulty getting settled permanently. Or will they even be given that chance? After long silence in his journal about Le Chambon during the period of his deepening discouragement, Strong jubilantly declared a, quote, red letter day on February 11, 1942, announcing that, quote, 5 students from Rivesaltes have been liberated and will leave Friday for Chambon. After months of pushing and struggling, it has finally accumulated and something is going to result. I had just about given up all hope when this joyful bit of news came through. I still don't believe it and won't until I actually see them in Chambon. What a joy it will be when it has really become fait accompli. I know them all personally, so it makes it all the more interesting and wonderful. Strong hurried to Le Chambon. As he subsequently wrote his parents, quote, I was on hand to greet the first 5 students that we would liberate from one of the camps. I don't think I've ever seen 5 fellows express such happiness and joy, and so demonstratively. It is hard for us who have never been interned to realize what it meant to be free. He also noted that how important this was for his own sagging spirits. Quote, I am planning to go back to Chambon to stay at the house rather frequently, and I know that each time will be a visit of encouragement for me. Strong spent the first evening talking with 5 students, 2 Spaniards and 3 Jews, as they shared their stories. Quote, it is a remarkable story of the past 5 or 6 months of Europe's tragedies. Not one of them had led a normal life, or even the chance to grow up quietly. Either they were engaged in the Spanish Civil War, or else kicked out of Germany because they were Jews. Thank God that we have been able to really help a small group, he concluded. And may this house become a haven of refuge for many more. Thereafter, Strong's focus increasingly shifted to Le Chambon. Quote, the main thing now is to liberate students from the camps for the student house, he wrote in early May, by which time some 20 students had arrived. There was a daily routine for them. Rise at 7, breakfast by 8, rooms cleaned by 9, manual labor between 9 and 11, language class 11 to 12, lunch at noon, study in the afternoon, and an evening lecture. Additionally, some of the students attended Pastor Trachme's Bible study. Quote, these are extremely interesting, as the Jewish students take their Torah scrolls with them, which they know by heart. They keep the pastor on his toes, intellectually and otherwise. Fortunately, he is an exceptionally fine person and carries his end of the work very well. By summer, the student population had reached 30, and they were assigned to work in the fields, helping out peasants in the district as a reciprocal gesture for all the help the community had provided. It was at this point of seeming stability when Strong was being kept in Geneva for a prolonged period of time because of the loss of other key European student relief personnel, that suddenly the world of the Jews in southern France, including the Jewish students at the Hotel de Roche, was turned upside down. In the 2 years after the 1940 defeat, the Vichy regime had chafed in particular at the presence of the last waves of Jewish refugees, whom they had been unable to prevent entering the country. None constituted a greater symbol of humiliation than Germany's brutal deportation of 6,500 German Jews from Baden and Pfalz into the unoccupied zone in October 1940. Thus, the Vichy regime had ordered the internment of all Jews who had entered France after May 10, 1940, and it was this contingent of foreign Jews that made up the primary population of the internment camps visited by Tracy Strong and other relief agencies, while many foreign Jews who had arrived in the pre-war period still lived and worked outside the camps. As late as June 1942, the Vichy police chief repeated to his Nazi counterpart the hitherto vain request that Germany take back at least 10,000 of its Jews from the unoccupied zone, not realizing that this time the Germans, having reversed their own Jewish policy from one of expulsion to extermination, would not only agree, but ask for more. Indeed, in early July 1942, the Vichy regime reached an agreement with Nazi Germany, according to which the French police would help with the deportation of all Jews from France as long as foreign Jews, including those in the unoccupied zone, were taken first. The first great roundup of Jews, using the card files and manpower of the French police, began in Paris in mid-July, and deportation trains departed 3 times weekly from transit camps like Drancy, where the arrested Jews had been assembled. To swell the pool of deportees and delay the day when French Jews would be seized to meet the deportation quotas, the Vichy regime, without German participation, began seizing foreign Jews in southern France and turning them over to the Germans. Between August 7 and 14, 4 trains carried 3,329 foreign Jews taken from the internment camps at Gurs, Rivesaltes, and elsewhere. On August 25, another 1,184 foreign Jews were seized from work sites outside the camps and were deported. Then on August 26, a great police roundup of foreign Jews legally living outside the camps, such as those registered at the Hotel de Roche in Le Chambon, began. Between August 29 and October 22, at least 5,916 additional foreign Jews were seized, assembled at Rivesaltes, and then deported north in order to be turned over to the Germans, bringing the total to 10,529. In short, Vichy France did not just meet, but actually exceeded the initial quota of 10,000 foreign Jews from the unoccupied zone. Treacy Strong was in Geneva as these disastrous events began to unfold in the month of August. On September 3, he wrote his parents, quote, "With the events in France what they are, and they are becoming worse and worse, hundreds of refugees are flocking across the border into Switzerland. No Jew in France is safe anymore with these new after them in our house in Chambon. 3 of them arrived in Geneva today, and of course the first thing they headed for was our office." Thus his first task was to help those foreign Jews who escaped France to Switzerland to, quote, "get straight," as he put it, with the Swiss authorities. But now he informed his parents he was going back to France, even if he did not, quote, "know if there's anything much that can be done." He returned briefly to Geneva at the end of the month and hinted in a letter to his parents at how little he had so far been able to accomplish. "I don't think I could exaggerate the deportation of the Jews. It is hard to see some of your good friends put on boxcars and to be sent away without being able to raise a hand to help them at all. I have been able to stay right with them to the last minute, but that doesn't change anything. I'm really becoming to believe in demonic forces that are greater than any one person or group of people." Despite the futility of the September trip to France, he announced his intention to return to France once again. Quote, "As long as I can work in France, I shall do so. It is hard because you are on the go constantly, and in no place do decisions become so far-reaching, really matters of life and death." From the result, he wrote his parents again on October 11, revealing that he had at least found one case in which he might be able to save endangered Jews. Quote, "The question of the Swiss visas seems to be the most important one now. 4 of our students have them, but can they use them? It is not yet decided whether or not they will be able to get visas to sortie. A decision is to be taken in Vichy next week, but will it come in time to save those people who have Swiss visas or are about to get them? I hope that we will be able to get visas for the rest of the students, but we'll have to work on some other track as we won't get any more." Concerning the students who already had visas, he noted, "They have all been in Switzerland once and were turned back at the frontier. I stop and wonder how we're going to get them out of here." Strong's own correspondence does not relate the rest of the story of the students who had been turned back from Switzerland, now indeed had visas, but were interned in Rivesaltes unable to use them. Before we take up that story from another source, let us return to the last fragmentary evidence left by Strong himself. On October 20, he jotted down a description of one of the last deportations from Rivesaltes that he witnessed. Quote, "The convoy went off with about 108 people in it. People on each side of the fence were moving to the tracks as they left. Police all around the place. Old ladies, young girls, men and boys, all piled into the truck and driven off. It was really about the most painful departure that I have witnessed. The next letter was from Geneva, written on November 11th, the day German troops poured into southern France in response to the Allied landings in North Africa. He, in fact, had arrived in Geneva on November 6th, and the Swiss-French border had been closed for Americans the following morning. By hours, Strong had avoided being interned as an enemy alien himself. The fate of the Jewish students with Swiss visas we learned from a survivor, Hans Salomon, who had been among the first 5 students whom Strong had welcomed to the Hotel des Roches in February 1942. In August, when a raid on the Hotel des Roches was imminent, the Jewish students scattered and found shelter with farmers. Some of his students successfully crossed the border into Switzerland, where Strong helped them that August, but not all. After weeks in hiding, Solomon and 4 others were provided with false identification papers and disguised as French Boy Scouts headed for the Swiss border. Guided over the border, they were arrested on October 7 by Swiss police, who told them that they had come 5 days too late. The border had just been closed. Trying to slip back into France undetected, they were arrested by the French border guard and sent back in handcuffs to Rivesaltes, the assembly camp for transports to Drancy and Auschwitz. There, Solomon encountered Tracy Strong and learned that Swiss visas had been procured for him and 4 other students. Strong credited the French Protestant organization CIMAD with obtaining these visas, as the European Student Relief for which he worked had not specialized in emigration, legal or otherwise. But getting released from Rivesaltes was still a problem. The 5 young Jews were still in Rivesaltes when the Germans entered the southern zone, but for reasons unknown, though perhaps in silent protest, a local official signed a release order, and they were allowed to depart from Rivesaltes, and this time legally cross the border into Switzerland. Arriving in Geneva, they were met by Tracy Strong, who took them to his apartment for Swiss chocolate and pastries. Many years later, Solomon arranged for Strong to be honored in a ceremony in Philadelphia as a Holocaust rescuer, an apt concept now in common usage, but one totally absent from Strong's own writing. The Hotel des Roches continued to function for another 8 months. In November 1942, Daniel Trocmé, the second cousin of Pastor André Trocmé, became the new director of the Hotel des Roches, and new groups of refugees flowed through. Ultimately, 86 people, at least 46 of whom were Jews, found refuge for various lengths of time there until disaster struck the Hotel des Roches in mid-1943. In late May 1943, German military police descended upon the Hotel des Roches. Generally, the German army had been relatively tolerant of activities in Le Chambon, where the prevailing ethos of nonviolence meant that it did not have to worry about the French resistance there. However, on this occasion, the military police arrested a German man who was probably a deserter from the German army. In shielding a wanted German, the Hotel des Roches had crossed the line of German military tolerance and thus opened the door for far worse. 1 month later, on June 29, the Gestapo descended upon the Hotel des Roches and arrested not only 18 students, but also Daniel Trocmé. Of the 18 residents, 5 were murdered in Auschwitz, 3 were sent to concentration camps in Germany, 4 were imprisoned in France but survived, and 6 disappeared without a trace. Daniel Trocmé was murdered in Majdanek. In retrospect, we can see that 2 key decisions or approaches to Tracy Strong's work transformed him from a humanitarian relief worker into a Holocaust rescuer. First, while most other relief workers strove to make life better for the internees within the camps, in the depth of his discouragement about his own lack of success in this regard, in the winter of 1941-42, Strong shifted his focus and passion to getting young internees out of the camps. The establishment of the Hotel des Roches and Le Chambon and getting young internees legally released from the camps in the summer of 1942 inadvertently turned the Hotel des Roches into a staging ground for the ultimate escape of many young Jews when the roundup of foreign Jews began in August 1942. Many who otherwise would have been trapped in the camps were able first to evade the police roundup and then cross into Switzerland. Second, when some of his Hotel des Roches students were arrested and interned once again in Rivesaltes, where they faced imminent deportation, Strong once again went beyond providing last-minute comfort to the doomed before they were deported and focused on getting at least a few Jews out of Rivesaltes. We do not know who in the Swiss Foreign Embassy in Bern approved the one-time grant of presumably unauthorized visas to Strong's Jews. Nor do we know the French official who signed the papers that once again, contrary to standing policy, released them from Rivesaltes. But we do know that Treacy Strong was the key broker who connected these two acts that, once combined, enabled 5 more Jews to escape both Rivesaltes and the final solution. The story of Treacy Strong at the intersection of individual, group, and communal rescue efforts not only illuminates what one creative and compassionate individual could do, it also sheds light on several wider controversies that have recently come to the forefront of historical debate. The first relates to a controversy unleashed by Carolyn Moorhead's book, Village of Secrets, published last year. The American publisher HarperCollins' publicity for the book claims that it, quote, sets straight the record about the events in Chambon and tells that story, quote, in full for the first time. Moreover, it claims that her book is also a story about myth-making. In her book, Moorhead argues for a perspective that emphasizes the importance of the entire plateau over the village of Le Chambon, of key women and not just men, of people of diverse backgrounds and not just the Huguenot religious community, and of those rescued other than Jews. She downplays the centrality of Pastor Trocmé and his doctrine of nonviolence as, quote, but one small part of the story, and reduces the estimated number of Jews saved from 5,000 to 800. Though much of this is not entirely as new as her publisher's publicity implies, these positions alone would not have occasioned a particularly critical response. But in the afterword to the book, Moorhead mischaracterizes and denigrates Philip Hollier, who wrote the first book-length study, an admittedly hagiographic treatment of André Trocmé that brought widespread attention to the rescue activities of Le Chambon. She characterizes Hollier as an historian who helped construct the myth of the goodness of Trocmé and the Huguenots of Le Chambon, and relentlessly and inappropriately pushed his own moral message of nonviolence and pacifism. In fact, Hollier was not an historian, but a philosopher and ethicist by profession, who quite naturally focused on the ethical implications of his study, and his pioneering work, despite its inevitable imperfections, was foundational for spreading broader awareness of Le Chambon and stimulating further research. In my opinion, Hollier in his book deserved a much more balanced, less contemptuous treatment. The second alleged mythmaker, about whom Moorhead is quite dismissive, is Pierre Sauvage in his documentary Weapons of the Spirit. Let me be quite open as possible. When I first saw this film, I thought it was a powerful, indeed superb documentary. Having seen it again recently, I am still of that opinion. Furthermore, Pierre Sauvage has interviewed me for another film he is making. We have become friends, and he both offered me access to his letters and journals of Tracy Strong and arranged for me to meet and interview Strong the year before Strong died. I'm indebted to Pierre Sauvage, and I'm clearly not an unbiased, neutral party to the issues contested between him and Moorhead. Those who wish to reach their own conclusions should read both Moorhead's afterword and Sauvage's rejoinder. I would, however, note that Treacy Strong was an eyewitness recording his observations at the time and not constructing some myth decades later. On a tip, he came to Le Chambon to investigate the possibility of establishing a safe haven there for young people interned in Vichy camps. Within 24 hours of his arrival, he was convinced he had found the right place because of the plentiful availability of food on the one hand and the conclusions he reached about the spirit of the town after meeting Trocmé and observing the Huguenot religious community on the other. For Strong, the centrality of Trocmé and the Huguenots was self-evident and decisive in his own decision to proceed with establishing a safe haven at the Hôtel des Roches in Le Chambon. A second historical debate, to which the story of Treacy Strong contributes, concerns the so-called French paradox, namely how to explain the survival of 75% of the Jews in France, where the collaborationist Vichy regime passed its own anti-Semitic legislation and French police turned over Jews to the Germans, even in the unoccupied zone, while much lower percentages of Jews survived in countries with less powerful Nazi collaborators and less indigenous anti-Semitism, such as the Netherlands and Belgium. The recent book by the French historian Jacques Semelin, Persecution and Mutual Help in Occupied France, How 75% of the French Jews Escaped Death, argues that by 1942, the bulk of the French population was much less anti-Semitic and much more prepared to aid Jews than previous historians have allowed. A revision not fully accepted by the pioneering historian of the Holocaust in France, Robert Paxton. The letters and journals of Treacy Strong do not speak directly to this issue, but they do shed light on and confirm the importance of another important factor that differentiated unoccupied France from the rest of the Nazi sphere in Europe, a factor upon which Semelin and Paxton in fact agree. This was the presence of a large number of what we now call NGO humanitarian relief organizations that were able to operate in unoccupied France in a manner without parallel in the rest of Europe. These organizations, including the French Protestant CIMAD, the Jewish Organization to Aid Children, the Quakers, the American Joint Distribution Committee, and Strong's own European Student Relief, coordinated their activities through the Nimes Committee, chaired by Donald Lowry of the French YMCA. Contacts were made, procedures were developed, networks of cooperation were formed, orphanages and safe houses were established that created a pre-existing infrastructure available for rescue efforts when the deportation crisis struck in August 1942. A network of Jewish and non-Jewish French and international relief organizations working together to improve the lot of Jews in unoccupied France between 1940 and 42, dealing with both Vichy officials and the French public at large, created an atmosphere in which the very notion, much less the means of saving Jews from deportation and death, did not have to be suddenly invented in the summer of 1942. As dictatorships have long known, and what the case of Treacy Strong helps to illustrate, the presence of individuals willing to challenge government policies is important, but it is the ability of such individuals to work together with like-minded others that is most effective. Thank you very much.